Good morning to everybody on the West Coast. Good afternoon to everybody else. Thanks for making time in your schedule to be on this training Zoom meeting. Appreciate it. So I want to introduce you to Brian Lee. Brian comes to us today by recommendation of my friend Chuck DeGroat, and he's going to be serving us today by helping us to become increasingly wise leaders who can navigate this cultural moment we're living in, one that is rightly asking church leadership to do better. But we don't always know what that means on either side of that question. And so today, Brian's going to help us think through a complex and sometimes confusing tension point that exists where leadership malpractice sometimes emerges. And that is both the potential and the limits of, well, it's just the way I am, right? I mean, there's a lot of potential for just the way I am, just the way you all are. But are there limits to that? And how do we discern which is which? So Brian's going to help us do that discernment work and how to learn to be present to ourselves, both our upsides and our shadow sides, the part of us that is always transforming, but to do so in a way that when we're just being who I am, that it's not an imposition, but that being just who I am, others experience that is for their good. So in short, I think what we're looking for today within our overall clergy training is for greater self-awareness for the sake of better serving others. So as Brian speaks, we're not going to interrupt him for questions. So if you have questions or comments during Brian's presentation, put them in the chat pod, and then we'll get to as many of them as we can after the presentation. The video and the slides will be available when we're done with this. If you want to use it for vestry or your team or volunteers, anybody like that. And then don't forget to keep yourself muted so we don't have background noise. All right, Brian Lee. Hey, welcome. Glad to have you with us today. Thanks for serving us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bishop Todd. I'm really looking forward to it. And hello, everyone. It's quite a group here, and I'm really glad to see you. Thanks for joining us today and making time in your schedule for it. It's just the way I am. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that reasoning for the way that we do things, right? And before we jump into what that is and the connection between temperament and leadership malpractice, I'd love to hear from you. If you just open up the chat box and answer this question or finish this statement, I entered ministry because, or I entered the ministry to. And I would just love to hear kind of the ideas or the thoughts that are around for as long as whatever it is. I got into the ministry to work with people, to build teams. My primary position was as a worship leader. I love relationships, deep relationships. I'm not a social butterfly who kind of does really well with just kind of introducing myself at small talk. I like the deep one-on-one relationships. Proclaiming the gospel, obviously, discipleship, examining scripture. And I would just love to hear your reasons. So I hear to see the world transformed, to help people come and grow in faith and followership of Jesus. I love that. And so as we go on, just keep dropping those in and just kind of get an idea for why we are here and for why we started this in the first place. So often when it comes to things like leadership malpractice, like spiritual abuse, we don't hear stories of pastors and rectors and priests and deacons who got into ministry to harm people. You're just never going to hear that, right? And yet it keeps happening. So where does that come from, right? I'd love to start with just kind of giving you background on who I am, why I'm here. Big thanks again to Bishop Todd and for Chuck DeGroat for connecting us. I'm based here in Richmond, Virginia, is where I am. I've been pastoring for over 20 years, got my start at a local church in South Philadelphia in 1999. I've been leading worship, working with teams since then as an executive pastor as well. And over the years and the many environments I've been in, I've personally experienced spiritual abuse in 3 of those environments, 1 at a college and 2 in churches. And here's what I realized. You're likely familiar with the phrase, hurt people hurt people. And what I came to learn after my first true traumatic experiences is that it's not so much about the hurt as it is about awareness. That the leaders who had not only harmed me, but many others were simply unaware of the effect that they had on the people around them. And in their willful self-ignorance, they were leaving a wake of absolute destruction behind them. So I vowed to learn as much as I possibly could about myself so that I wouldn't become one of those leaders. I pursued lots of assessments and typologies, Myers-Briggs, DISC, Kolbe, StrengthsFinders, Berkman, Enneagram, Working Genius. I mean, you name it, I probably took it. And in the end, I want to understand as much as I am, as much as I'm able, in the ways that I think, feel, and behave in response to the world around me. And I want to know why I am the way I am, right? It's Paul's famous frustration vent in Romans 7. I don't want to do what I do, but I do it anyway. And I want to do this, but I don't. And I don't want to do that, but I do. Oh, what a miserable wretch I am. And so what happened was in that process, I landed in my last church position in 2018, arrived in hopes of processing and healing from some of this grief and my previous experiences. This church advertised themselves as a place of healing. They said all the right things. They offered us hope. And in the end, it was actually one of the most abusive and toxic churches that I had ever worked at. So we left in the summer of 2021, have been through lots of counseling, lots of reading, lots of learning. And in the last year founded Broken to Beloved. We are a 501c3 nonprofit that is focused on providing resources for those who are seeking healing and wholeness after spiritual abuse, religious trauma, and church harm, and providing resources for those who are wanting to grow in awareness and implement safeguarding practices as well, which is why we are here today. And I'm honored to be here with you again to recognize the work of Bishop Todd, C4SO, providing excellent resources for trauma awareness and response. I've watched several of the videos that you get to watch with Chuck, with Diane Langberg, with Peter Singer, and so many others. And it's just incredible what you are building here. The big question that I want to ask and answer today is, what is the cost of living an unaware life? What kind of wake do you leave behind you when you either live blissfully or maybe even willfully oblivious or ignorant? And what if a better understanding of yourself and your team could positively impact your relationships and simultaneously reduce the potential for leadership malpractice? It's a big question. I hope we'll answer it. We'll see how we do. Talking about temperament is not something new, right? It goes back thousands of years to the ancient Greek philosophers, Hippocrates, Galen. They talked about fluids and humors and cognition and senses and so much more. And we get these words from the Latin temperare, to mix or to blend. In psychology, temperament broadly refers to the consistent individual differences in behavior that are biologically based and relatively independent of learning, our system of values and attitudes. It's been defined as the constellation of inborn traits that determines a child's unique behavioral style and the way he or she experiences and reacts to the world. It's often understood as an indicator of emotional reactivity. And for our purposes today, we will identify temperament as the observable traits and behaviors that shape the way that we perceive and react to the world around us. And the word personality comes from the Latin persona, or mask. Some people would consider temperament a part of our personality. Others would say that our environment works on our temperament to produce our personality. We today are just going to understand them as patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are relatively enduring throughout our lifespan. And either way, I don't want us to get too stuck in the weeds of defining too finely the difference between temperament and personality, because whether you're familiar with the 4 temperaments or humors, the 5-factor model of personality, what we want to focus today has much more to do with an awareness of both temperament and personality on a very practical level. And what we're talking about is emotional intelligence, or EQ, and how that relates to leadership malpractice. How it can increase in one can have an effect, a decrease in the other, right? So emotional intelligence, popularized by Daniel Goleman. This concept was coined in 1990 by Peter Salovey and John Mayer. And in his research, Goleman found that EQ tended to be the highest indicator of success in organizations. And he says the most effective leaders are all alike in one crucial way. They have a high degree of what has come to be known as emotional intelligence. My research, along with other recent studies, clearly shows that emotional intelligence is a sine qua non of leadership. Without it, a person can have the best training in the world, an incisive analytical mind, and an endless supply of smart ideas, but he still won't make a great leader. And I think we may have all come across someone like that in our lives. So, what is it? Well, emotional intelligence is the ability to recognize, understand, and manage your emotions and the emotions of others. It's made up of 5 components. It's our self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skills. And when we look at the ways that these relate to each other, it really is answering 2 big questions. What is it like to be me? And what is it like to be around me? 2 hard questions to ask ourselves, right? And I think if we look more closely at these components, we also find a close alignment with our own calls to ministry. In terms of self-awareness, it allows us to have a clear view of ourselves in light of our identity in Christ. Self-regulation is the capacity for reflection and for self-control. Motivation has a lot to do with our calling and being content in that calling. Compassion has a lot to do with empathy plus action. And then social skills have a lot to do with connection and building those relationships, right? So, what happens when I avoid or refuse to grow in this emotional intelligence or in myself and others' awareness? Well, the results of self ignorance, and if you have a better word for an antonym for awareness, I would love to hear it because I use the best I can come up with is oblivious or ignorant, but they don't sound nice. So I'd like to not say self-ignorant, but I just can't think of a better term for it. When we lack in self-awareness, we risk a direct negative impact on our personal and professional relationships. And throughout the centuries, church leaders have held a consistent view of understanding and becoming more aware of ourselves and its connection to understanding and awareness of God's work in and through us, right? They draw a connection between our knowledge of self and knowledge of God, and that when we're unable to make that connection, we deny the image of our Creator in ourselves and in others. And if we are all indeed made in the image of God, then we should be treated that way, and we should treat others that way. There is no knowing of God without knowing ourselves. And when we lack self awareness, we also tend to take things much more personally. We receive objective feedback as an attack on our competency, character, or identity. And what often happens is that lack of awareness typically results in a high level of self consciousness. We tend to be more paranoid. We tend to think that everything is a personal attack rather than just an objective observation, right? Again, criticism is taken personally and not objectively. We're unable to separate our work from our character. Our identity gets all wrapped up in our position or in what we often identify as Henry Nouwen's 3 lies, right? I am what I have, I am what I do, or I am what others say or think about me, instead of our identities being rooted in Christ. And so we get quotes like this. And when this lack of awareness starts to become dangerous is when it inevitably begins to affect the people around us. Again, that wake of destruction that we leave behind us. We recognize that we are absolutely built and made for community. We cannot live out our faith alone or in isolation. It's meant to be lived in the context of others. And so when we lead our team, our staff, our church, and we somehow choose to live our life oblivious or ignorant, then we are absolutely prone to hurt or harm the people who are around us. And when we continue to see things the way only we want to see them, we also deny the image of God that is reflected in other people. I love this quote from Justin McRoberts: "The moment I refuse to recognize God in places and people that are unlike me is the moment I stop recognizing God." If we can take the approach with the simple and yet profound understanding that not everyone sees things the way I do, then we grow in our awareness of self and others and our ability to lead and serve well in our conversations, in our relationships, in our teaching, in our sermons, in our discipleship. And conversely, when we know that different people see things differently, and yet we continue to dismiss or ignore them, and instead we double down on our dogma, our doctrine, our reputation, our self-preservation, then we move towards a kind of malpractice. In the medical world, malpractice is a legal cause of action that occurs when a medical or healthcare professional deviates from standards in his or her profession and causes injury to a patient. And when we move that into a way to place more value on ourselves, our positions, our systems and institutions, rather than the humanity and personhood of others, we move towards that spiritual and leadership malpractice. And so we hear from Mitch Randall, who wrote a great paper on theological malpractice: when loving God and neighbor falls by the wayside to preservation of institutional and professional reputations, then that, by definition, is theological malpractice. And we see so many times that theological and leadership malpractice are the roots from which spiritual abuse grows. We have a perversion of the gospel based on a flawed hermeneutical philosophy. We see things that are built on patriarchalism and misogyny, things that protect the reputations of clergy and churches and denominations and institutions rather than the dignity of individuals. We dismiss and debase the rights of victims. We can cause physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual damage. It perverts the gospel of Tov, of goodness, and any theological convictions and practices that harbor abusers or vilify victims should be truthfully regarded for what it is, which is theological and spiritual malpractice. At the heart of this malpractice is a failure to treat all people as God's image bearers. And it all starts with our own level of awareness. If we want to create cultures where this kind of toxic fruit can't flourish, then we have to be more intentional about being aware of what's in the soil. And a lot of this comes from McKnight and Behringer's book on Pivot, right? What's in the soil determines the health of the fruit. And the process of cultural transformation cannot begin without an unflinching assessment of your own institution's culture. Asking those hard questions, right? What is it like to be me? And what is it like to be around me? And then how do we each ask that question of ourselves and of each other? There's going to be a lot of courage required, right? It may be the most important character trait necessary for the practice of discerning what your church's culture is like, and knowing up front that the existing culture will resist learning the truth about itself. It is hard to examine ourselves and to be truthful about what we find. And so again, we start asking those really hard questions. What is it like to be me? What is it like to be with me? What is it like to work with me or for me? What do you know about me that I don't seem to know about myself? I mean, that's a really vulnerable one. And at the end of the day, these two quotes I love: that turning on the lights poses no danger. It just shows us what was already in the room. And from Chuck DeGroat, the healthiest systems resist delusion and live in radical honesty, no matter the consequences. So, how do we protect ourselves from this kind of spiritual and leadership malpractice? It starts with becoming self-aware, which begins with a proper view of ourselves, right? We need to right size our view of ourselves in light of God and in light of Scripture. We need to be aware of who we are and where our identity is rooted, whether it is rooted in one of those three lies or whether it is actually rooted in Christ. And being honest that even if we are rooted that way, we're going to be pushed and pulled all the time based on how our day is going, right? We can be having a great day and then you get a phone call or a text message and it just all comes crashing down. Or the other way around, where you're having a hard day and just one phone call from a congregation member or an email or a kind letter can turn it around, right? And it can swing between extremes as well. You can have someone who's a really arrogant and narcissistic, entitled kind of person who's holding on to position and power. They consider themselves as God's only anointed one. I am the mouthpiece of the Lord every Sunday morning. And oh, look at how God speaks through me. Our church is the only church with the correct doctrine. And on the other side of that, you have people who walk around with this false sense of humility and make themselves lower than they are, as if they're not worthy of dignity and if they're not worthy of the love of God, right? We have this tendency towards a toxic worm theology, right? I'm but a lowly worm in need of grace. And both of these things can be true, but we don't need to push them as far as they go sometimes. And so when we want to have a sober look at ourselves, I find these two scriptures to be really helpful. That we shouldn't be overly arrogant. We shouldn't have a false sense of humility and make ourselves lower than we are, but to have a confidence in the gospel and in who God says that we are, right? So to have a proper view of ourselves, what are we? Who are we? We're image bearers. As Christians, we're convinced that every human being is an image bearer of God, that we are all created in his image. This conveys a divine sense of dignity to every person that we meet and interact with. We are all under shepherds, right? As Diane Langberg talks about, that we are not the head shepherd. We are not the great shepherd. We are stewards under a great shepherd. Chuck DeGroat writes, pastoral shepherds are not entitled to loyal, adoring sheep. Pastoral shepherds are entrusted with all kinds of sheep, and they don't get to pick and choose the ones that automatically fall in line. We are also part of one body. We are not the head of it, right? 1 Corinthians 12, Romans 12, Ephesians 4. The body has many parts. Many parts make up the whole body, and Christ is the head, right? And then finally, we are our fellow brothers and sisters. We are not spiritual fathers and mothers over our staff members, elders, board, congregations. We are peers. We are stewards of. And there is one spiritual father. There is one spiritual head at the end, at the beginning of all of it. And with all the growth and all the learning that we may do in our self-awareness, we also need to be cognizant of the fact that self-awareness is just the beginning. That even after all of this, awareness is not enough. And Steve Cuss has an excellent book, Managing Leadership Anxiety. And this is just so helpful. That thinking about the way that you think is just one thing, right? Because we all know people, and he says it right there, I am what I am, and that's the way it is. And what we're going for is beyond self-awareness. He also says that awareness is critical, but it's not the path of growth. It's just the gate. We have to unlock it and walk through it, and then do the difficult work that brings us to the next thing. And so the one thing that we walk away with today, I hope, is extremely simple, and yet I hope deeply profound, is that different people see things differently. It sounds really elementary, and yet I'm constantly surprised by how often we just assume that everyone sees things the way that we do. And so to illustrate this, I want to share a story from the book Becoming Us by Beth and Jeff McCord. And it teaches us a fun word. Stephanie and her fiance, Dustin, were deep in the middle of planning for their upcoming wedding on a Saturday afternoon. They were running errands and making final decisions about major details of their ceremony and reception, and needless to say, they were tired and stressed. As they were driving to their next appointment, and Stephanie looks over at him and says, I know there are a lot of details to get worked out, but one thing is really important to me. I'd like to get a nice wedding band. Dustin looks over and says, why? That seems crazy. And she heard contempt in his voice, but quietly said, there are a lot of things that I don't care about, but I think having a nice wedding band is important. He looked over at her and said, don't you think you're being a little ridiculous? Well, I've always wanted a nice wedding band, she said. Dustin said, I just don't get it. I think it's nuts. And at this point, tears start filling her eyes. She says, I'm just trying to tell you this is really important to me. And she quietly turned her head toward the window. Have we all been in this moment of tension before? And Dustin, being the hero that he is, senses that she's upset and said, look, I'm just saying, I think you're being ridiculous. Stephanie says, if it's a matter of money, I can contribute. That's even more crazy, he said as his fists tightened on the wheel. And now tears are rolling down her cheeks, and they're both tense and quiet. Finally, she broke the silence and said, it's something I'm going to have for the rest of my life, and I just thought it would be nice to get a good one. The rest of your life is just for one night, and I think it's a waste of money to spend on a wedding band that's just for one night. Wait, one night? I'm talking about a wedding band. to go with my engagement ring, not a wedding band to play at the reception. Really? He says, the whole time I thought you were talking about a wedding band to play at the reception. No, I'm talking about a ring, she said as they looked at each other and finally burst out laughing. How many times have we committed a suicide with someone in the middle of a conversation because we couldn't get out of our head the way that we were seeing or hearing it? And so understanding the ways that we commit a suicide fundamentally will shift our perspective. It allows us to see outside of ourselves. It allows us to approach situations with curiosity. It allows us the space to ask a clarifying question instead of just assuming that the way that we're perceiving it is the truth, right? And so we want to take some time to look at just how completely differently we can each see the world. And as we go through these, I'd love for you to see if you can identify the way that you see it, and even better, see if you can identify the way that others might see it. The person who drives you crazy on your team, or the church member who just rubs you the wrong way, is there a possibility that because you approach life differently and you see things differently, that it just doesn't make sense? But that you could both be correct, or that you could just be approaching the same thing from different angles, right? And before we go on, I'd love to set up some ground rules. The first ground rule is this: as we begin to talk about these tools for self-awareness, is don't use it as a sword. We don't want to attack someone else because of their personality, their temperament, their Enneagram type, whatever it is. It's just not nice to be attacked for the way that you are. On the other side of that, don't use it as a shield. This is where you no longer get to use the excuse, it's just the way I am. Because once you learn, there's something you can do, right? There's a great quote from Maya Angelou: do the best you can until you know better. And once you know better, do better. It releases us of that excuse, right? It's just the way I am. The third one is don't type others. As it pertains to the Enneagram, it is really dangerous to type other people because it's not about our behaviors, it's about our motivations. And I barely know what motivates me most of the time. It would be awfully presumptive to think that I know what's motivating someone else. Even more than that, there are plenty of people out there who have been typed by someone else, usually incorrectly, and then they go on living their life as if they're supposed to be that kind of person. And they end up living a life that isn't theirs to live. And then finally, do your own work. If we can each commit to do our own work of self-awareness and others' awareness to grow in our emotional intelligence, it will automatically improve our relationships. I don't know that any of us like to receive free life advice. Hey, you know what I heard about you and your personality? You should do this. I don't like when people do it to me. Let's not do it to other people. Can we agree with those ground rules? All right. So here it is. Here's the Enneagram. Listen, we're not going to dive into all 9 types. It's just not necessary for our time together today. Regardless of what your feelings are on it, I have found it to be incredibly helpful in understanding myself. Of all the tests and personality assessments I've ever taken, this has been the deepest by far, and has helped me the most. And so what we're going to do, instead of looking at the 9 types, we're going to break things down by triad, groups of 3, of which there are at least 4 different kinds. We've got different kinds of attachment and harmony triads. We've got relational and conflict triads. We've got stances. And we have centers of intelligence, which are usually just generically called triads. Today, we are just going to focus on 2, the centers of intelligence and the stances. And beginning with centers of intelligence, these identify the 3 primary and dominant processing sensors. We talked about that emotional intelligence having to do with recognizing the way that we see, the way that we feel, think, and behave, right? And these 3 triads for body, heart, and head help us to identify that. It also identifies a common emotional struggle and a primary desire. Stances, on the other hand, will take a dominant relational approach, a blind spot or repressed center of intelligence, and an orientation to time. So, starting with the centers of intelligence, we're going to start with 8s, 9s, and 1s, who are in the body center, also known as the doing center. They respond to the world by doing. When something happens, you just have an instinct. It's a gut feeling, which is why it's called the body or the gut center. I just know what needs to be done. And all three types will have a different way of doing that or feeling that. But they're all there together, right? 8 is jump and aim, fire, ready, aim. 9s have an immediate sense of what needs to be done. It just never occurred to want to do it. And then 1s are busy just fixing everything all the time, right? They also have a common struggle with anger, and they display this in different ways. 8s often have an outward display of anger, usually in hopes of trying to control it, but it's just like for 8s, a bomb goes, there's just no release valve. It's just always open. So if there's any sense of anger, it just goes off. And for them, it's just a normal everyday. For everyone else, they're left bleeding out on the floor thinking, what just happened? For 9s, they have all this anger, but they forget it or they deny it because really what they want is inner peace. They want a nice sense of balance, right? So they just try to push the anger away. And then 1s turn all that anger in on themselves and they repress it. And then it leaks out sideways as a resentment. And then 8s, 9s, and 1s also have a desire for justice and control. They all have a high need for justice and fairness and for autonomy and control. They want other people to be heard. They don't want other people to be harmed. They root for the underdog. They need justice and ethics and morality to win out at the end of the day. So 8s, 9s, and 1s, right? Respond by doing, struggle with anger, desire for justice. Hold on to that, and now listen to just how completely different our next triad is. In the heart center, they respond with feelings. When something happens, the first thing they want to do is have a feeling about it. How does this make me feel? How does this make you feel? Right? They respond from the heart. 2s focus on other people's feelings. How are you? How are you doing? People are drawn to 2s and they just love them because they take care of everyone. 3s read the room. They sense what everyone else is feeling, and then they forget or push aside all those feelings because they slow me down and I have too much to do. And then 4s swim in an ocean of their own feelings. It's just kind of delicious to them. They also have a common emotional struggle with shame. And what they do is they try to push that shame away in different ways. 2s will focus those feelings outwards in hopes of not feeling their shame. So they look for validation or affirmation. 3s deny those feelings in hopes of resisting shame. And 4s focus those feelings inward in hopes of avoiding deeper shame. And really what they want at the end of the day is significant identity. They want to know that they mean something to someone. So they go about their lives, helping others, achieving things, standing out, whatever it is, so that they will gain that identity with someone. Do you hear how completely different that is from the gut center or the body center, right? And then finally, to round it out, we have 5s, 6s, and 7s in the head center or the thinking triad. They respond by thinking. Completely different again. It has a lot to do with, well, something happened, so what do I think about it? They have a common struggle with anxiety or fear. 5s are afraid they're not going to do well. They're afraid of being incompetent, so they will gather all the information they can to make their anxiety illogical. 6s are just anxious about everything and all the possibilities. They often get typecast as worst case scenario planners. Really, they are every case scenario planners. And when anything happens, they're ready for it. So they consider anxiety as another threat that will destabilize their security. And then 7s are anxious about being trapped in their pain or being limited in any kind of way. So they just go explore all the possibilities. They're actually the fastest thinkers on the Enneagram. And then they have a common desire for safety and security. So fives will seek it through knowledge and knowing and looking for answers. Sixes will seek it by knowing the possibilities and building a tight-knit circle of loyal people around them. And sevens will seek it by avoiding their inner world of anxiety and just looking to experiences to fill that void. So, thinking, feeling, and doing. Three really, really vastly different ways of perceiving life and responding to the world. Can you begin to see how this already sets us up if we are open to recognize the way that we operate and that there are at least two different ways of doing life to be more gracious and empathetic and compassionate? And I'm curious to see if you are willing to put in the chat if you think you are in the body, heart, or head triad, just to look around the Zoom room and to see how we occupy these three different spaces already just together in one room. So if you think you can identify which one you are in, the body center, the head center, or the heart center, go ahead and drop it in the chat. And this will help us to kind of get an idea, and it will also help you start to narrow down, grow in your self-awareness, and see how the way that you function may be different from the way that other people function. So here's how our new awareness works. For those of us in the body triad, we just jump into action. We want to do things. It makes no sense why anyone would need to use their feelings to do that. Those feelings slow me down. I have things to do, right? Or why do I need to think about it? These are things that I need to do. For those of you who are in the heart triad, you live by those feelings. How can other people be so calloused? Why are you so insensitive? You're always just rushing ahead and doing things. Don't you realize the effect that you're having on other people? And can't you see the way this made this person feel, right? And for those of us who are in the head triad, why can't we just be rational about this? Can't you just turn to logic and understand that this decision is going to affect this thing? Because if you do this, it's going to affect all these other things, right? Can't we slow down before jumping into something or making a decision? I just need a little bit more time to process. I just have a few more questions, right? So we can see how we inhabit the world so differently and how we might so quickly and easily perceive other triads as strange or backwards or even wrong. But when we can shift that perspective and view others as necessary and additive to our experience, then we can begin to view them with that grace and empathy and compassion. If the centers of intelligence are determined by what is most dominant, then the stances are defined by which one is most repressed. And this is where some of those different lenses become much, much clearer. If you've ever been to the eye doctor and they pull down that big machine in front of your face, the phoropter it's called, and they have, which one's better? Is it 1 or 2? Is it 3 or 4? Every next layer of the Enneagram that I've learned has helped to make that image much clearer. And so hopefully that's what the stances will do here. We begin to see even more clearly how the lenses by which we see things affect the way that we see and operate in the world. Based partly on the work of psychologist Karen Horney, the stances give us another set of triads to examine how we view the world. They show us how we relate to other people, which center of intelligence is most repressed, and interestingly, the most interesting to me is our orientation to time. So we'll start with 1s, 2s, and 6s. They are in what's called the dependent stance. It's often also called the compliant or dutiful stance because we are thinking repressed, which always sounds offensive to 1s, 2s, and 6s because they say, I think all the time. And then you ask them the question, how much of that thinking is productive? And they say, oh no. Because most of that thinking is just overthinking. It's just circular thinking, and it's not getting them anywhere. They tend to default to the rules and belief systems in order to know what to do. They live every day by the words should and ought, which is why they are often called the compliant or dutiful stance. They will more often do what is expected of them and rarely do what they actually want to do. They're constantly concerned with what other people think about them. They're generally focused on others and the larger group rather than on themselves. They try to think through what is actually needed before instinctually following the rules or systems you have in place. They are also moving towards other people to get their needs met. So they wake up in the morning, they think they know what they want to do, but let me just go check with this person. That's what it means to move toward others. Let me just get some affirmation. And then based on the feedback that I get, I might change my mind and do something else instead, right? They react to stress by moving toward and serving other people. Ones will move toward them by following the rules in hopes of earning their autonomy. Twos will move towards people by loving and caring for them in hopes of earning attention and love. And sixes will move toward people by being loyal to other people in hopes of earning their security, right? And then they are oriented to the present. They are tethered is another term to the present. For a 1, 2, or a 6, if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. The most important thing to me is the thing that's right here in front of me right now. It's not that they don't think about the future plan. It's not that they don't think about the past and reflect, but it's those things are kind of irrelevant right now. I'll write them down so I don't have to remember it, right? But what's most important is the thing that's right in front of me to do right now, okay? So as you hear that, let's compare and contrast now. 3s, 7s, and 8s are in what's called the assertive or sometimes the aggressive stance. They take charge and they're happy to share their agenda. They move against others. Sometimes they push against others. And really what's happening is they're standing independently. They don't care what other people think. They just wake up in the morning, they know what they want to do, and nothing will stop me from doing it. So either you can help me, or you can get out of the way, or you can get run over while I take care of my business, right? And that action of standing independent of others often comes across and gets perceived as pushing against. Why are you always pushing me? Why are you always pushing me? Why are you always? I'm not pushing you. I'm just doing my thing, right? A totally different way of seeing the world. They know what they want always, and then they just do it. It's like mind-boggling to people who are in the dependent stance. It's like, how do you just go do? It's like, what do you mean? Just do it. What are you so afraid of, right? So 3s move against by being assertive in their goals in hopes of earning that attention. 7s move against in order to satisfy their desires in hopes of earning their security. And 8s will move against by being assertive against others in hopes of earning their autonomy. I want to say about 8s that they don't necessarily need to control anybody. They just don't want to be controlled. There's a big difference there. They are oriented to the future. They are constantly thinking ahead. It's as if next month and next week and next year is happening right now, which is why when you interact with a 3, 7, or 8, everything feels urgent and important because everything is always plowing ahead. When you're in a staff meeting with someone in this stance, they are often the visionary person in the room. They will have a hard time celebrating something big that we accomplished because to them, that's in the past. We have this next thing to get to already, right? So they are tethered to the future as if the future is the most important thing. And then finally, they are feelings repressed. Feelings are not important because they will slow me down. And again, I have too much to do. So they tend to default to intensity in order to feel like they're okay. They may try to be aware of how you feel or consider feelings before instinctually demanding what you think you need. So if they have a feeling, they're going to push it down or push it aside in favor of charging ahead. Oftentimes, if you ask a 3, 7, or 8 what they're feeling, they just won't know what to tell you. Their face will kind of go blank, or they might tell you something they're going to do about it, or something that they think about, but it's not really actually a feeling or emotion, right? And then finally, we have the withdrawn stance, 4s, 5s, and 9s. 4s, 5s, and 9s in the withdrawn stance take the position of moving away from people. When the going gets tough, they get going. How can I make myself smaller in this situation and just disappear into the wall, right? They react to distress by moving away. And it doesn't mean that they can't be loving or caring or present. It just means that in general, They're going to look to themselves to get their needs met rather than look to others. 4s, 5s, and 9s. So 4s will move away by withdrawing into their idealized self in hopes of earning that attention. 5s will move away by withdrawing into their mind in hopes of earning that security. And 9s will move away by withdrawing into their inner sanctum in hopes of earning autonomy. Just leave me alone. And oftentimes, if you're in a conversation with a 4, 5, or 9, and they sense conflict or tension, you may sometimes have seen the light go out from their eyes and suddenly they're not there anymore, even though they're standing right in front of you. That's what withdrawing can look like, even though they are physically present. They are oriented to the past. Everything for them is tethered to the past. Obviously, they're here in the present, but everything that is important today only has significance because of, and they can chain all these events together that bring significance forward. Okay? And then they are doing repressed. They are often very slow to act. They tend to be more introverted, though they're not always. They are the last ones to step forward and take action because they want more time to process and think and feel about things rather than do them. Okay. And so when you look at these 3 stances, again, I'd love to see, and I'm starting to see now in the chat. Thank you, Scott, for that message to put it in the public one. Which one resonates most with you? Is it 1s, 2s, and 6s are the dependent stance? 3s, 7s, and 8s are in the assertive stance? And 4s, 5s, and 9s are in the withdrawn stance. And when you begin to recognize and identify which stance you are in and which center of intelligence you are in, it will offer a clearer view of yourself and of others, which paves the way, again, to grow in grace, compassion, and empathy. And you may also notice that by process of elimination, if you can identify both your center of intelligence and then your stance, you will determine your main type as well. So for me, I'm in the body center. I function by doing things. I constantly struggle with anger. And I really want justice and fairness and autonomy and control. And I'm in the dependent stance. I recognize that I'm always looking for affirmation before I make a decision to do something. I'm very much present-minded. For me, if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. And so being an 8, 9, or 1 in the body center and being in the dependent stance means I'm a 1. And that's me. So you can do that same process of elimination for yourself. I also want to share that if you've taken a test or an assessment before for the Enneagram, they are notoriously not reliable. They can be up to 60% wrong. And the reason for that is because they are testing for motivations and not behaviors, those are really difficult to assess. And depending on your own level of self-awareness, you may be gaming the system and answering the questions in a way that you think it wants to be answering. You may be answering them in a way that is aspirational. This is who I wish I was. You may be answering them just unaware of your own self. And so they tend to be up to 60% wrong most of the time. The only way to reliably determine your type is to do it yourself. So whether you read a book, read descriptions, get coaching, work with someone to get a typing session done, that's the actual way. So if anyone tells you otherwise, that a test will tell you 100%, don't believe them. Just so you know. And then finally, I want to show one more example of the ways that we see completely differently. And I love seeing all of this in the chat for people who are identifying these things and where you are. The last one that is really, really interesting is generational management. And I'm seeing a fairly wide range of ages here in the room today. This comes from McCrindle Research, which is an Australian-based research firm. And I heard about this study recently from Matt Tressiter, who's the CEO of Leader, is an online platform for leaders to work together. And I found it really fascinating and illuminating. And it talks about generational management. There are really easy examples based on each of our generations, and I'm not sure which one you identify yourself with, but that we tend to stereotype other generations and their working style or their work ethic. You can find, I don't know how many social media accounts that either explain or parody the generational differences in the workplace. A boomer manager will be like this. A Gen X manager will be like this. A millennial manager will be like this, right? And they have these kind of hypothetical conversations. And it always makes me laugh because they are very true. What if we used our awareness of ourselves and of others to find solutions and build bridges rather than continue to perpetuate bad stereotypes that really just don't honor the gifts that each generation offers? What if we determined that because different people see things differently, including the way that we work, including the way that we want to be managed, instead of saying, I mean, probably 5 years ago now, maybe even 10, all you heard from the boomer generation was the kind of this disdain of millennials or Gen Y or Gen X. Oh, they just don't want to work. They just don't want to do this. They don't want to do that, right? And now we're starting to see just how untrue that was. But because they wanted to do it differently than that generation, they could only view it as bad or wrong. What if we recognize the differences not as a bad thing, but simply as different? Maybe as a product of our times, possibly even as an opportunity to learn from each other and to grow with each other. So I want to offer you 6 different generational management and leadership styles and preferences. The builders want a controlling commander. Boomers want a directing thinker. Gen X wants a coordinating doer. Millennials or Gen Y, a guiding supporter. Gen Z, an empowering collaborator. Gen Alpha, which is just being born, inspiring co-creators. Do you see just how wildly different these are? Does anyone else find this as fascinating as I do? It's just such a stark reminder that not everyone sees things the way we do. Not everyone wants to do things the way that we do. And that's not a bad thing. Different people see differently. And it's not bad. It's just different. And different is good. Because if 1 Corinthians 12 and Romans 12 and Ephesians 4 are true, and that we are all part of one body, that we are all individual members, and we can't say to someone else, I don't need you, then these things also have to be true. That when we view things differently by the way that we think or feel or behave or prefer to be led or managed, it doesn't make it bad or wrong. It just makes it different. And different and diverse is necessary if we are to function as a whole body of Christ, right? We need different and diverse points of view, voices that are in the room, perspectives represented at the table. And finally, we have to remember that ultimately it is God's church. It is his work, not ours, in and through us, which should provide us with hope because it is his church and not ours. We don't have to do the work to prop it up or to defend it or to hope that it won't close because it is his church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. We are stewards. We are under shepherds. We are fellow members of the body of Christ with a healthy and proper perspective on our place and our role, with a proper view of ourselves, right? And so we move toward grace and compassion and empathy. And through this awareness of ourselves and awareness of others and the way that we each think, feel, and behave, we can see and treat each other with dignity and respect as brothers and sisters who are co-created in the image of God. And hopefully we can move toward healthier cultures and away from that spiritual and leadership malpractice and abuse. And that's all I've got. So thank you so much for your time, everyone. If you want to contact me, here's my information. And again, the slides I think will be sent to everyone afterwards as well.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Super, super helpful. So people aren't chatting questions yet, so I'll give them a minute, but I think we're going to switch gears, everybody, to use the raise your hand function since that's actually easier than trying to monitor the chat box at this point. And if you don't have a question, I was thinking maybe you want to offer Brian a Thanksgiving, like say, hey, Brian, thanks so much for, and name an insight that can be helpful as well. So Brian, I'll get us going though. I mean, we all know what it's like to like teach these kind of things and then go away thinking, I wish people would blank. What's the one thing you wish all of us haven't heard this teaching? Like, what would be your big wish that like the one thing or the first thing or something that we might do in response to what you've taught us?
What a great question. Thank you. I think my biggest wish is that you wouldn't walk away having heard any of this and just dismissing it.
How do you see
I already
how
know about myself. I
sorry.
already,
Okay, good.
I don't agree with the Enneagram. I don't, whatever this is, whatever preconceived notions you may already have about anything, the whole point is to try to see something, anything differently, to not cling to your own worldview, to cling to your dogma or your doctrine or whatever it is your closely held beliefs, and to entertain the idea that maybe someone else who sees something differently or lives differently might not be wrong, and that there might be some value in it.
Great, thank you. Okay, Jenny Seibel, you successfully put something in the chat. Go ahead, unmute yourself and go ahead.
Well, other people had hand raised before me, but since you called me by name, I'll go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Brian, I just want to say thank you. And that's not all I want to say. I want to say thank you. I also have so many questions. I think this was really helpful and is just like the beginning of a conversation, in my opinion, which I know is why you do the work that you do, because it is the response to the beginning of a conversation. So I guess like where I would start is like, would you say that leadership malpractice is the same thing as power abuse? Because when I saw the email come in about the title of this talk, I was like, that's a really kind way of saying what I think is power abuse. And one of the reasons I'm asking is because I think power abuse is really easy to get confused about. It's way easier if someone just commits a sexual sin who's in leadership at a church. Power abuse is much easier to cover up or say it's, like you said, just the way someone is, or even gaslight, because they're typically at the top when they're power abusing. So that's a very large, complicated question, and maybe more of a comment, but I just would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, Ginny. Here's the thing. I think leadership malpractice is a really kind way to not say spiritual abuse. And yet I think it is true. And I think there are distinctions, although they may be nuanced. Because some narcissists will gaslight you without really realizing that's what they're doing. And other ones absolutely know exactly what they're doing. And one can be sort of a malpractice of, this is just the way I've always done it, or no one's ever told me otherwise or pushed back against it, so I just don't know any better, right? This is the whole reason for this is the way I am. And the ground rule of don't use it as a shield, because once it's been pointed out to you, you can't just walk around anymore saying, oh, well, I didn't know, because guess what? Now you know. Right? And that's why I love that Maya Angelou quote, that do the best you can till you know better. Once you know better, do better. So once you learn about what gaslighting is, are you willing to go to someone who is trusted on your team, or to your spouse, or to someone else who you know, and say, hey, have I ever done this? And be prepared for the answer. Or, any of those things. So malpractice isn't always malevolent, right? It isn't always on purpose. Sometimes accidents happen. Sometimes we just mess up, or sometimes we're having a bad day, so we react rather than respond. Versus, I think abuse usually is done with some kind of premeditated intent in mind. So I think there can be a difference between the two. They can sometimes overlap and be the same. But also, if we're going to invite a whole bunch of rectors and priests and deacons and leaders into a room, we're not going to get them here by saying, hey, come learn about abuse. The leadership malpractice may be the kinder way to get them and say, hey, we want this to be a safe space for you too, because we realize a lot of leaders are being called out for stuff like this, and it's not always abuse either. So it's an educational moment for us to learn and grow together.
Thank you,
and if you want to have more conversations, I'd love to hear from you, Ginny.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Rob Patterson.
Hey, thanks, Brian. I was just wondering, what are some of your favorite Enneagram books and tools?
Yeah. Todd Wilson's got a great one, When the Enneagram Goes to Church, because it's specifically written for that. AJ Sherrill also has two good ones, although I can't think of the names of them. I think one is Enneagram in the Way of Jesus. The other one might be something along the lines of Spiritual Practices 4. I think those are probably three of the best in terms of for ministry and in terms of the church life. Chuck DeGroat writes about the Enneagram in his book, When Narcissism Goes to Church, which I think every leader should read because it's just a good way to look in the mirror and say, is this me? And then let someone else read it and ask them, is this me? Asking those hard, vulnerable questions about ourselves. And I think that's what makes the Enneagram so uncomfortable for people, is it digs the layers beneath the behaviors to say what's really going on under there. But I think those are some of the top ones for me.
Brian, here's one from Ben. I think it's probably Ben Chase in Pasadena. You touched on the leadership differences. Sorry, you touched on the generational differences of leadership. Can you say more about best practice within multi-generational staff teams?
Thank you. I'm not sure that I can, but I'll try. It depends on which generation you belong to. It depends on how well or ill represented other generations are. And I would say that a good practice, I don't know if it's best practice, is to be open to different ways of doing things. Right? It's if we can intentionally and strategically keep working to build bridges between generations and not dismiss them because, oh, they're old, they're from the old guard, they just want to do it the way they've always done it. It's like, well, there's probably a reason they want to do it. So can you ask them that question? And are they honest and aware enough to say, oh, you know what? I'm asking for this because I recognize, right? It's trying not to commit a suicide over and over again and pausing long enough to ask those clarifying questions. So when you recognize that something is rubbing you the wrong way about a specific generation and the way that they want to work, oh, they don't want to come to the office, they just want to work from home, they're just doing this, they're virtual, this and that, whatever it is. So whatever it is, something is going to rub us the wrong way about some other generation. And what's a way that I can choose to be curious about where that's coming from for myself before I go and react to the situation? And in all of the coaching that I do, almost all of it stems on how can I move from instinctive reactions towards thoughtful responses. So anytime I have a gut thing about whatever it is, I try to check it and just say, okay, what is that? Is it valid? Is it true? Is it kind? Is it helpful? Or is there another way I can approach this? So hopefully that's helpful, Ben.
Thanks, Brian. This is kind of a practical question that I assume has to do, Brian, with your ministry, your organization. Do you offer any tools for 360 feedback for a leader to self-initiate with a staff about self-understanding, and/or do you offer coaching for leaders who seem to be struggling with a lack of self-awareness?
Yeah, thank you, John. I think that's John. Yes, I absolutely offer the coaching for individuals and do workshops for teams as well. 360 evaluations are a little bit more complicated. So if you want to email me, and we can definitely talk about that. I have tools for it, but what it would look like to implement in your situation might be different for each person. But yeah, I'd love for you to email me and let's talk.
Okay, I see one more. Ryan Bradley, I'll get to you in a moment. But if you have other questions, raise your hand. And/or if I think it might be, I think we would actually learn if we could hear some Thanksgivings too, if you have them. If not, we'll be done when we're done. Ryan, go ahead, please.
Well, I am really thankful, but I have a question.
Well, give your thankfulness and your question.
Yeah, I think you gave us so many wonderful things to follow up on. Pieces of it that were really familiar and pieces that were brand new to me. The generational piece. I know some of the Enneagram stuff really well, but those other sets of triads were brand new to me. So I'm really fascinated on following that up, and thank you for introducing us to that. The question is, when I think about my own emotional intelligence and self-awareness, it's really easy for me to think of sort of me at my best and most flourishing, or me at my most tired and stressed out, and the gap between those two. Can you talk something about how to narrow that gap because it's really easy for me to see, like, I'm feeling good about myself today. Here's everything I'm capable of. Now I'm in a meeting that I'm already going in exhausted. Some people said some really cruel things to start it off. And it's really hard to be that same person or to respond as well as I would have the day before.
Yeah, what a wonderful question. There's this idea of radical acceptance and honesty. And so when I'm working with my clients and doing coaching, we talk a lot about that middle ground. And the way that I tend to present the work is that most Enneagram language out there will talk about levels of health, right? I'm healthy, I'm average, I'm unhealthy. And I talk about in terms of awareness or alignment with the gospel. I'm aligned with the gospel, I'm misaligned with the gospel, or I'm out of alignment with the gospel. And really, 80 to 85% of our life is lived in that middle space. I am misaligned with the gospel, which means I believe in the Bible. I believe that God loves me and saved me. I believe that Jesus came for me. And I know that God is busy, so I need to contribute just a little, right? I know that you've got things to take care of, so let me just jump in here. 10% of our time maybe is spent living aligned with the gospel. It's, I believe God loves me and I'm living like it. Isn't this great? I am rooted in my identity with Christ and I know who I am and he's created me and called me to do these things. And then 10 to 15% of our life is spent living completely out of alignment with the gospel, which is not that I belong to God. I don't believe in God. It's just I'm completely on my own and I don't belong to anyone. And therefore I'm in survival mode and I have to do everything I can and take everything under control to make sure that I can survive. And so it's easy to identify those extremes, but really 80 to 85% of our time is spent living in that middle space. And so what does it look like to radically accept where I am in that space and just to become aware of it? Hey, I'm having an average, ordinary day right now. And that's okay because this is the way that I'm wired. This is the way that I'm going to function, and I am aware of that. So when I walk into this meeting tired, I know I'm walking into this meeting tired, which means I don't have to pretend that I'm not tired. I can just say it up front. Hey guys, thanks so much for being here. I just want to give you a heads up. I'm really tapped out today and I really want to be here, but forgive me if I'm a little short or whatever that is, right? And just instead of heaping more shame and judgment on ourselves for just being who we are, can we move towards that radical acceptance and awareness that says, hey, this is where I'm at right now. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just been a day, right? And so the more we can move towards that radical acceptance, toward grace, compassion, and empathy, including for ourselves, not just for other people, it'll go a long way.
Brian, what are the ways in your experience when people hear this teaching that they misapply it?
Yeah. It happens more often than we want to admit. I think it's why I love the title so much. It's just the way I am, because that's often how it happens. Or when we have leaders who are clinging to a false sense of identity, clinging to power and control, maybe who are narcissistic, they will take that information and weaponize it and turn it against someone, which is why we set up that first ground rule. Don't use it as a sword. Personalities, temperaments, styles, preferences are not meant to be used as weapons against people to say, oh, you're being such an 8 right now. Oh, you're being such a 2. Oh, you're being such a Gen X kid. You're such a millennial, right? It's like, it never feels good. And it does more work to divide us than it does to unify us. And so that is absolutely a danger for any of us, is to take this information with us and see, how can I use this against someone, or how can I prop myself up with this information in a way that makes me look better or feel better about myself, rather than that really honest assessment and awareness of ourselves to say, you know what, I'm just as flawed as anyone else. I'm no better or worse than anyone else. And having that proper view of ourselves that is not overly arrogant and confident, but also not that false humility that makes me worse than I am either.
Yeah. Brian, I know nobody can say everything, in an hour-long talk. But as I was listening to you, you weren't able to get at this, but I can tell that underneath your thinking, just knowing you a little bit, is some theology. Like there's a relational ethic in the New Testament. And I feel like there's an ethic attached to what you're saying. Can you say a bit more about that? How do you see relational ethics, sort of New Testament, Pauline, Jesus, biblical ethics attaching to what you've taught us?
Say a little bit more about how you want me to answer that.
Like, count others, as more valuable than yourself, or, treat people with humility, et cetera, et cetera. Love your enemies, on and on. It feels like there's it feels like you're giving, I'll put it this way, and then you can respond. It feels like you're giving us tools, well, for a lot of reasons, but some really good tools for living into the biblical ethic of leadership and the way we deal with each other. And not in general, not least when we have power. Like you said, everybody here is in some sort of position of power.
Yeah, that's a great question. Trying to think of how I want to respond to it. And I think I'll do it this way, that even though we have all been called into ministry, it doesn't mean we've necessarily been called into leadership. And I think that the American church today has developed a cult of leadership. And we have to be really careful when we find ourselves in these positions, not to form our identity around that. So when we want to pursue a biblical ethic or a relational ethic, it is in light of that proper view of ourselves that does not put ourselves as at the head. I am not the grand poobah of my local whatever this is. God has to be in that place. Christ has to be in that place. I am a fellow steward. I am an under shepherd. I am a fellow brother or sister in Christ. I am not the spiritual father of this church. I've heard pastors say that, and it kills me every time. God is our spiritual father, right? So what does it look like? I mean, just if I can just do enough to have a proper and sober view of myself in my position and place, it will do a lot to right size some of that thinking and that relational dynamic that we have with others. There certainly is a lot I could say about leadership culture. I prepared about twice as many notes as what I shared today.
Well, I know how that goes.
There's a whole section on pastor versus leader.
Yeah.
Right. Because in the church, we've taken this business approach to leadership, and pastor as CEO, right, or rector as CEO rather than as shepherd, and more specifically under shepherd, right? We are under shepherds, as Diane Langberg talks about, and so, rectors and priests become leaders and entrepreneurs and visionaries and vision statements and all these things, and then you've got to measure all of those things and have strategies in place. And it's like, this is not the way of Jesus. This is not about hierarchy and position and place and who reports to who. What does discipleship look like? What does it, I'm in the process of writing an article. I was supposed to do it 3 days ago, but I keep getting sidetracked with other stuff, and I'm still kind of chewing on it. I just finished the book, How to Walk into a Room and When to Walk Out of One by Emily P. Freeman. And she interviewed her husband on her podcast recently, where they talked about some of the reasons for leaving their church. And in it, I was really challenged by the idea that her husband, and they're both spiritual directors, so they do the work of discernment very often. And the sentence that he said that really caught me off guard is, when it comes to doctrine, when it comes to relationships, when it comes to how do we do church, they approached their pastor about, hey, there's this topic and we're not really sure what to do about it. Can we just have a conversation? And the pastor's immediate response was sin. This is a primary issue of sin. And it was clear that he wasn't going to be convinced otherwise. And as an Enneagram 1, I'm very much about right and wrong and black and white and following the rules. And this is the way it should be for everyone, to be fair across the board. And I recognize how often being right can be the wrong thing. And so when John Freeman, her husband, asked a fellow friend about this, the response was this: you're leaning up against the wrong tree. and you're trying to rest at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, come to the tree of life. And I immediately thought of, I also recently heard or was reflecting on two of the women in the New Testament, the woman at the well and the woman who the Pharisees brought out to be stoned. And I'm struck by the way that Jesus responded to both of them. He very easily could have condemned them or judged them for the life that they were living. And instead, he invites them to life. And so what does it look like for us to lean and rest at the tree of life rather than just the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Because what good do all the rules do me if I can't relate to someone or love them? And I also keep coming back to, because this comes with my work of self-awareness, because I recognize just how horribly judgmental and critical I am. And so I've done a lot of work to overcome that it's not judgment, it's not sin, it's not shame, it's not pointing out the rules that brings people to repentance, it's kindness. So what does it look like for someone who's lost or floundering or made a mistake or intentionally did something wrong to approach them with kindness rather than beating them over the head with scripture? So I don't know how much that answers relational ethic or biblical ethic, but that's what I'm wrestling with today. That's kind of where I'm at.
No, super good. I know what it's like to be put on the spot like that. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah.
All right. Hey, to all my colleagues, I'm so glad you're here today. I know others will listen asynchronously. I'm so glad to be doing ministry in a community of leaders who want to grow and to be different and better. That's very encouraging to me. And Brian, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for your work. Thank you for your heart, your mind, your passion for all this. We're really grateful for the contribution you've made to us today.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Bye, everybody.